All good. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth for the inquiry into Australia's transition to a green energy superpower. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 7th September 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I welcome our witnesses, Austrade, and we also have the Export Finance Australia via video conference as well. Just for the records, would you like to just state your name and the role that you're here in, the capacity that you're here in? We can start off with Mr. Simiot.
Thank you, Chair. Xavier Simonet, CEO of the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry into Australia's transition to a green energy superpower. Let me first talk briefly about the role of Austrade as an agency.
Sorry, it was just an introduction of name.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and then I've got another little section to read out.
Apologise.
And then we'll go on to the...
So Sam Guthrie, General Manager for Government and Policy at Austrade.
Thank you.
Andrew Morris, Manager of Hydrogen Team at the Resources and Energy and Infrastructure Centre of Excellence at Austrade.
Good afternoon. Alvin de Almeida, Manager, Energy and Resources at the Centre of Excellence for Resources, Energy and Infrastructure at Austrade.
Good afternoon. Frances Van Ruth, Head of the EMEA Investment Desk at Austrade.
Good afternoon. Dan Tibbett. I lead the team that supports Australian exporters in resources and energy and infrastructure.
Thank you. The hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a short opening statement and then we'll proceed to a discussion. Thank you.
Apologies again.
That's okay.
Xavier Simonet, CEO of the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. Thanks, Chair, for the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry into Australia's transition to a green energy superpower. Let me first talk briefly about the role of Austrade as an agency before specifically articulating our contribution to the energy transition. Austrade's role is to promote international trade and investment. We are a Commonwealth government agency and we fully align with government priorities. In our role, we assist Australian exporters in growing and diversifying overseas. We also connect international investors to opportunities in Australia. This matters as 1 in 4 Australian jobs come from export and 1 in 10 Australian jobs are from foreign direct investment. Now, coming back to the inquiry's terms of reference, our definition of the green economy includes renewable energy and emissions reduction capabilities. In that context, our work is broad. It covers energy from natural renewable resources such as wind, solar, and hydrogen, but Austrade also works in grid strengthening capabilities such as battery storage and the key inputs that go into battery storage, such as critical minerals. We are significantly contributing on both the investment and export sides. On the investment side, renewable energy is undergoing a boom in foreign direct investment, but Australia would require huge amounts of foreign direct investment to accelerate the transition and become a green energy superpower. Austrade's role is critical in engaging with international investors, promoting investment into new Australia-based projects, downstream processing and value chain creation. Similarly, on the export side, Austrade actively engages with overseas customers for both renewable energy and key inputs to the energy transition, such as critical minerals, to deliver offtake agreements and accelerate project development. A combination of equity and offtake agreements are most important for Australian project proponents to de-risk their projects and access the necessary capital for development. Our trade teams also assist Australian companies to export energy solutions and underpinning mining, engineering, and tech capabilities. Our work is delivered through our extensive network in 107 locations with 66 locations overseas and through our teams of sectoral experts onshore and internationally. We also work closely with other Commonwealth government agencies as well as with state and territory governments. Thank you, and we're very happy to answer your questions.
Before we go to questions, it was remiss of me also not to ask the Export Finance Australia, who are here via video conference, to introduce themselves and to make a short statement.
Thanks, Chair. I'll introduce our team and then we'll make a short statement. I'm John Hopkins. I'm the Managing Director and CEO of Export Finance Australia.
Sorry.
Amanda.
Amanda Copping. I'm the Chief Customer Officer, Project and Structured Finance at Export Finance Australia.
Thank you.
I'm John Pacey. I'm the Chief Credit Officer of Export Finance Australia.
And
Thanks, Chair. And with your permission now, I'll make a short statement.
yes.
So I just want to start by thanking the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. Export Finance Australia is the Australian Government's export credit agency. We've been in existence for over 65 years. We have a mandate to support Australian exporting businesses, including businesses in the export supply chain. We also finance Indo-Pacific infrastructure development that provides benefits to Australia. Over the past 10 years, we've provided more than $9 billion in financing, supporting almost 700 customers with exports to over 100 different countries. This has supported over $30 billion in exports and projects. We're a self-funding agency who has returned over $200 million in income to government over that period. We are working to support Australia's transition to a low emissions export economy, consistent with our mandate to support exports. As a commercial financing agency, our role is to fill a market gap for finance where private sector finance is not available. Over the coming years, there will be new export opportunities in low emission fuels, technologies and commodities. New technologies and commodities can make these opportunities riskier for the private sector. That has been our experience with critical minerals, which is one area where we are currently supporting Australian exporters to take advantage of the emerging clean energy economy. As part of our role supporting this sector, we administer the government's $2 billion critical minerals facility on the national interest account. This facility is helping to develop critical minerals projects in Australia, which enable green technologies like electric vehicles, wind turbines and batteries. To date, the government has approved over $1.49 billion in finance for Australian critical minerals projects under this facility. We're also providing financing on our commercial account to critical minerals projects and small businesses working in the supply chains of these projects. In addition to our export mandate, we are also delivering finance for Indo-Pacific infrastructure where there is an Australian benefit, including in areas such as renewable energy and energy transmission. In doing so, we are helping to support Australia's reputation as a supporter of renewable energy and infrastructure financier of choice, and be an infrastructure financier of choice. Look forward to answering any questions the committee may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins, and we'll open up for questions. I might start off with Mr. Simonet from Austrade. You spoke about critical minerals, and in fact both of you spoke about critical minerals, but you mentioned that we'd need a huge acceleration of investment to actually centre ourselves as a major exporter of critical minerals. One of them that comes to mind is lithium. What sort of work's been done in that area to look at accelerating the investments?
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to ask Alvin to answer the question and give a sense for the scale of what we're doing and the number of projects, and then we can talk about investment as well.
And if there's any questions during the discussion that you wish to take on notice because you don't have the information present in front of you, that's fine as well.
Sure. But we've got a number of subject matter experts, so we'll try to do our best to answer the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Lithium is well and truly at the forefront of Austrade's critical minerals expansion work. We support numerous critical minerals companies with business matching. We do this by introducing the critical minerals project proponents, the producers themselves, with potential offtake partners around the world. And we do this by means of trade missions. We have bespoke trade missions to various regions around the world. And as a matter of fact, we have just concluded a trade mission to the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And we do this with targeted business-to-business matching. And another alternative is the annual Critical Minerals Prospectus that Austrade produces. The 4th edition will be published on the 14th of December this year. And the prospectus highlights critical minerals investor-ready projects in Australia. And the new edition will have 56 projects at investor-ready status, and the projects themselves will be run by 53 different project proponents.
Thank you.
And if I can add a couple of points, Chair. First one is to say I was this year twice on trips with ministers with critical mineral delegations, one in the US with Minister Tian and one recently in Korea with Minister Farrell. It's very powerful to have businesses with government working together, particularly in these new industries that require a bit of a push and political support, and to have the Australian minister with the Korean minister and their trade delegations around them, and EFA was there as well, talking about opportunities and how we can help them and how government can play a role. That was very, very powerful. I just want to say another word about our role. Our role is obviously to connect investors to Australia and help exporters of technology particularly. But it's also about informing other government agencies, particularly policy agencies, in areas like hydrogen or critical minerals, which are new areas for government. And it's the opportunity for us to be the voice of business and contribute to the discussion and tell those agencies what businesses think, what they think the gaps are, and how government should position itself. Maybe you want to give say a few words around investment?
Thanks very much, Xavier. I'd be happy to reflect on Austrade's role in investment attraction more broadly. As Xavier mentioned, Austrade focuses on promoting, attracting and facilitating productive foreign direct investment. And FDI is so important as it contributes to 1 in 10 jobs and has a positive impact on productivity and wages. In particular in relation to renewable investment, in addition to the examples that Alvin has provided, we work directly with foreign investors to connect them in with opportunities in Australia to help them establish and expand their presence. We do this through the provision of market intelligence, information on business and regulatory environments, introductions to stakeholders, specialists and relevant Commonwealth and state and territory government agencies, as well as providing support for visit programs when senior executives come down to Australia.
Thanks. If you look at the different sectors in different countries currently, which ones present the greatest opportunity, I suppose, for us to export growth in the global green energy sector? Would you be able to just say this country, that country is showing potential for us to export to, or is that not identified at this?
We work with the metrics of countries and sectors and align our resources to government priorities, but also where we see the opportunity for Australia to deliver quality investment and trade. Maybe you can say a few words about trade opportunities and where you see them.
Thank you for the question. Just to give a picture of my team, we essentially work with Australian companies, helping connect them with export opportunities overseas. It's safe to say there's a lot of interest from many different markets, but I think Europe is undoubtedly one of the biggest drivers, Europe including the UK. We see strong interest in all sorts of renewable technologies and services provided by Australian companies. In the UK, Singapore, obviously we've just signed the Green Economy Agreement with Singapore. US to some extent, but probably more Japan and Korea presenting opportunities. And maybe just to give you a sense of the scale of the work that we do, in the last 2 financial years, we've worked with approximately 250 Australian companies working in the energy sector a little bit more broadly, and looking at companies that are working more specifically in the green economy. We've assisted about 51 companies achieve commercial outcomes. That's kind of typical of the sort of conversion rate we'd achieve. So around about 68 export deals worth $27 million So this is companies that produce technology, equipment and services in Australia, often commercialising IP developed in Australian universities.
If I can add to that in the context of hydrogen, the ranking that we would put for potential export markets would be Japan at the top, Korea second. It's like, so our North Asian partners who have been traditional fossil fuel importers of Australian fossil fuels. We would also put Taiwan, Singapore, and other countries which are dependent on LNG and coal from Australia and are now looking to transition to lower carbon alternatives. But in Europe, Germany is now emerging as a potential partner for Australia. It's likely that those molecules might travel through a third country, for example, the Netherlands, but that is looking very prospective for Australian hydrogen exports in the future.
So the opportunities in Europe being a bit of a latecomer, I suppose, is that due to the trade deal discussions that we're currently having with them, or is it just something that's evolved on its own?
Look, I think that it's evolved for a number of reasons. Countries like Germany are now looking at, as the rest of Europe is, to remove themselves from a single supplier relationship with countries like Russia, for example, and looking at alternative like-minded partners like Australia. So for them it makes sense to partner with us, even on an endeavour which seems sending molecules all the way up to Europe might not have been something in the psyche until a couple of years ago, but it's looking like a reality now.
And Senator, two big themes that we hear when we travel overseas or from our network are around food crisis and energy crisis. This is positioning Australia at the centre of the opportunity, and Australia will be a superpower in terms of energy, and in terms of food, to guarantee food security and energy security. That's how then we make it happen, which is basically our job.
Yeah.
If I may reflect, pointing to the connection between trade and investment, the strong connection in an area like renewable energies, the countries from which we're seeing investment interest very much align with the companies that Dan and Andrew have mentioned. So in particular out of Europe, the UK, Japan and Korea, that would account for over 2/3 of our pipeline of investment opportunities in renewable energy.
If I may add to what Mr. Simonet said, it's energy security, but it's also, particularly in Europe, it's the policy settings driving the transition towards net zero energy emissions reduction. An example that we talk about for Australian rail infrastructure companies, service providers and so on, when they're bidding for tenders in Europe, they're being told that the criteria are obviously the quality of the project, the cost, but also the contribution to the net zero agenda for the rail operator, for example, in that country. That's becoming much more important.
Thank you. I might, just before I hand over to the Deputy Chair for his questions, ask Export Finance Australia if they want to add anything that's relevant to what we were just discussing.
Look, Chair, I agree with what Austrade have said in terms of the primary markets. Again, at those large current energy receivers from Australia, those countries where they're showing interest in the renewable space.
And may I just add that more and more we work with Export Finance Australia hand in hand to make sure that we offer end-to-end services to our clients, which includes funding, but also all the services that we offer.
Thank you. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Can I firstly start by complimenting Austrade on your visibility? I live in a regional area in Queensland, and a lot of our agricultural equipment, in particular specialised equipment that comes from Holland and other, Austrade is always part of the conversation growers are having. So compliments on your visibility. Now, one of you mentioned hydrogen and the potential export. I have two parts to this question. One, I want to get a sense of when do you think, from a time perspective, hydrogen comes online. We had a brief last week from DFAT, and they mentioned some numbers, and it's on our Hansard, and we've asked them to come back with some stuff. but they mentioned they put a measurement, or I think it was 15,400 pegajoules or something of energy, which we currently export as a country, before, as of today. And I was trying to get a sense from them, if that traditional sense of export with our the new policy position of a green energy superpower, and that phases out, what is the equivalent replacement energy of, and someone mentioned wind and solar earlier on, how many solar farms and solar wind farms and solar panels do we have to just get us to where we are today into the future? And they were able to tell us how many jobs it was going to require, but then suggested the answer to that question was best asked of you.
Sure. Why not? Alvin, Andrew, would you like to answer?
Sure. So maybe starting with when's this going to make economic sense? Where are we going with this? In 2020, the Australian government set a stretch target of H2 under 2, which refers to hydrogen, 1 kilo of hydrogen for the cost of $2 or less. Now, that's the sort of inflection point where hydrogen starts to make sense for firming electricity, for making ammonia, for other applications that it might be competing against natural gas for. So we're working on that right now. The best estimates for and when I mention H2 under 2, we're talking about out of the farm gate, not delivered to customers, but produced on site, and then from there, obviously, there'll be additional costs to get it to customers. We're on a trajectory at the moment, but there's a lot of work to do. We're currently pricing around a bit over $5 a kilo, so there's still a lot more to bring it down. Now, that stretch target will be for the applications I referred to earlier. However, there are going to be some sectors in the economy which are going to be more likely to use hydrogen before we get to that. And those are cases that use a lot of liquid fuels that need to be transported to sustain whatever the industry is. It could be remote power, for example. If you've got a diesel generator set somewhere and it's all the way in a remote location, you're going to likely be able to use more cost-competitive hydrogen at an earlier stage than the $2 a kilo. So there's going to be a set of different industries that come online with hydrogen at different times. And those hard-to-abate sectors, the ones that certainly can't be electrified, for example, shipping, where it's not going to be sensible to put a battery in and the like, those ones will come online, but we're still going to need a drop in the cost curve to get there. So a lot of what the focus and attention of the Australian governments is to try and get that kilo price of hydrogen down. And the two major factors are its input cost and its capital cost. The input cost is, in the case of green hydrogen, going to be renewable energy. So we're going to have to still see a steep decline in renewable energy in solar and wind for us to get there. The other major capital cost for green hydrogen is the electrolyser cost. Now, like we saw in the solar PV industry, there's been a rapid decline in the cost, but that only happens with scale. So we're going to need to see a market for green hydrogen domestically to stimulate it, and of course globally as well. And so if we get onto those factors, and we see a greater efficiency from those electrolysers, we're going to get to that target that I mentioned.
So have you done any modelling at all as to when you think the time frame is? They're the factors that affect the time frame, but the actual time frame.
The Clean Energy Finance Corporation has recently done a study with Advisian, which looked at 22 different industries and gives you a pretty good insight into when they see them coming online. At the moment, the best guesstimates are going to be in the early 2030s, but those are being revised downwards all the time.
Yep. And did DFAT say last week, Chair, that is it 11 litres of water for 1 unit of hydrogen?
Nine is, so it's 9 to 1 for the water situation. Yep.
With are we the most arid country in the world? How do those two correlate?
Yeah, so what it's going to be about is water management, and also, I mean, at the moment that's in the states and territory hands, but the other thing about water is you can use alternative technologies, desalination. You can look at sewage water treatments processes. You could also look at stormwater, and those are three areas that are being seriously looked at the moment. And the cost might appear, or at least you get a sense that it'd be prohibitive, but it actually isn't based on the studies that we've been looking at, particularly for desalination. I think the figures were closer to around an extra 5 cents on top of the cost to add those sort of pieces of infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Just before we go to the next question, just for the members who came in a bit later, we do have the Finance Australia on the teleconference as well. Tanya.
Thank you.
Or
Thanks very
Ms.
much.
Lawrence, as I should say.
No worries, thank you. I'm just interested to understand where you see the key opportunities for value add in exports, and perhaps where the targets or the priorities are.
Sure. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, very happy to speak to that. So my name is Dan Tebbit. I lead our team that works with Australian companies exporting equipment, technology and services, many of which comes out of our Australian universities. We've worked with approximately 250 Australian companies in the last 2 financial years, and about 50% of those have signed commercial deals through that period. We're actually working with companies all across Australia and looking at a couple based in Western Australia. Power Ledger is probably one of the better known ones. They have a blockchain-based solution for energy trading. I guess in response to the Deputy Chair's question, if some of this is about where the jobs come from as well, those energy networks of the future are going to look quite different to the current energy networks as well, and a lot of these companies that we're working with are about different types of energy networks, so managing demand, managing distributed networks, and so on. So quite different styles of networks. So, Power Ledger being one example, others that do microgrid technologies and so on. Yesterday I was up in Newcastle meeting with a company there that has a grid-scale energy storage solution that they're just looking to commercialise. One of the companies that we've been working with, there's a public case study in detail on our website based in Adelaide called Energy Exemplar, and they do software for modelling demand to help actually optimise and predict what energy networks need to look like to be effective. They've grown from 55 staff to 300 staff in the last 5 years, and have 11 offices around the world.
Senator, if I may add something, what strikes me is that we talk a lot about Australia exporting resources and energy, but I think we should talk also a bit more about what we're doing in exporting services, connecting to those new energies and renewable opportunities. We celebrated last week with the National Annual Export Awards, and some of you attended the dinner. Those amazing Australian companies, some of them are really small, some of them are bigger, that export mining, engineering and tech solutions. And this is also our job, to make sure that they can scale up and can expand internationally based on the opportunities through the energy transition.
And are you seeing an increase in companies from overseas and governments obviously making approaches to partner locally with industry and business in the green energy sector?
We certainly are. Excuse me. Frances Van Ruth, I lead our EMEA investment desk, so working with foreign investors that are looking to establish and expand in Australia. So of our, what we call our investment pipeline, so these are project opportunities that foreign investors are talking with us about realising in Australia. Well over half the value of our total investment pipeline relates to low carbon economy. And we've certainly seen an increase in interest, particularly this year, from regions like the European Union, from the UK, and as we mentioned earlier, Japan and Korea. I think that correlates with the reopening of borders. We're seeing more companies and executives being able to visit Australia as well, and Australian delegations heading overseas.
And sorry if I can just round that out, because last week we heard from DFAT that spoke about the potential cost of exporting hydrogen is, at this time, appreciating very, very early, it's expensive, and that industry might need to rethink where manufacturing happens, and maybe manufacturing needs to come to Australia and to be closer to the source of the energy supply. And I just wonder whether, in the terms of the value add equation, whether you are also getting approaches about manufacturing coming to Australia, where traditionally it has been done in perhaps some of those partner countries you mentioned earlier.
Yes, absolutely. I think what our objective is in hydrogen is to sell more than just the molecule. We're already looking at projects that use hydrogen as a derivative. Green ammonia, of course, is a big one, and I know that we've got a couple of projects with international partners on foot right now. We also look at electrofuels, things like methanol and others, which will have a natural market as well. And of course, the green metals proposition is a big one. It's not a near-term proposition for us just yet, but we're doing what we can at Austrade to attract the right interest from those steel mill producers and the like, who are seriously contemplating whether it makes more economic sense to be in Australia.
Wonderful. Well, certainly it's and I'll just say it's very exciting that you're looking at non-traditional sectors of how to become a green energy superpower. Like the fact that you mentioned services is really fabulous, because I think there is so many different spin-offs, and you mentioned about the trading platforms and the like, and I think that's actually quite expansive for this committee to be thinking through the possibilities. So thank you.
Thank you. I have questions from Mr. Baxel, then Senator Polly, and then over to Mr. Colbeck. So we'll start off with Jerome.
Thank you, Chair. I'd imagine in sort of the contemporary free trade agreements that the Commonwealth signed, there'd be quite a very explicit reference to green energy transition or clean energy. How does that work within, I guess, established or long established or existing free trade agreements? Are there any opportunities for that to exist in older free trade agreements that the Commonwealth signed?
I think that Sam Guthrie, Government and Policy. I think
Sam.
our colleagues at DFAT are probably better placed to talk about what's possible, but I think what is an exciting step forward is things like the Singapore Green Economy Agreement that's recently been signed. That's a new type of agreement that Australia hasn't done before. I think that it sets a model that can be used elsewhere, including and importantly across Southeast Asia. And it does put the transition of both countries, of both markets, front and centre to the agreement, and looking for ways that we can support each other through that transition. So I think that there are new agreements like that we can take forward. And then I know, and it's better for colleagues at DFAT to speak about it, but I do know that we are looking at those existing trade agreements and what can be done with the future of those. But in addition, the fact that those agreements are in place today means that there is a strong trading relationship already between those countries. And given that Austrade are market-led and responding to what our clients want, this is the discussion that clients are having with us today. So the client, where there is already a market relationship, the client is asking us to turn our minds to the transition. And so we move in that direction from a business perspective as well as the agreements themselves.
And would, like the existing ones, apologies for my ignorance, do they get updated, or from time to time, little administrative things, or is it just that you go along like the green energy agreement, sort of a new thing, or do you just update the existing one? How does that work?
So so our colleagues at DFAT lead all those negotiations.
Okay, right.
The Green Economy Agreement, though, is it's a recognition of leaders of both countries, governments in both countries, wanting to embed arrangements in the relationship, focusing it on our ambitions for the transition. So that's a new agreement of its kind, and as I say, can be rolled out to other markets. Usually within a free trade agreement, there is various ongoing dialogues around the trade agreement once it's signed, which brings the two countries together to continue to talk about how it's progressing. And I would think that in those sort of fora would be the opportunity to consider renewal or review the progress of those agreements. But again, I can feel DFAT colleagues shirking at me for me speaking to it, so we're best to ask them.
Apologies. One final question, that's right, Chair.
Senator, if I can just add something, I think beyond the FTAs, with the geopolitical situation, things have dramatically changed, and there's complementarity between what Australia can provide and other economies. I was recently with Minister Fell in Japan and Korea. They need more food and they need more energy. And they're trying to be, of course, to increase their autonomy and to be more self-sufficient. But as like-minded countries, there's an opportunity for Australia to step up and contribute to a certain level to their energy and food security.
Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Senator Polly, then
Yes,
I'll go to Senator
thank you. I just want to know how the Export Finance Australia encourages banks and financial institutions to actually finance the export opportunities in this marketplace.
Thanks, Senator. Look, we work very closely with the banks as part of our general operations. So part of our role is really to catalyse private finance often. So by our involvement in some of these particularly critical minerals projects, it really demonstrates to the banks that there is a commercial opportunity to support those projects. So often we will work not just on our own to lend into these projects, but with groups of other financiers. But we find ourselves, when we're one of the early participants in a financing, we find ourselves encouraging other financiers into support these new investments as well.
So I know in my home state there's contracts being exchanged between hydrogen developers and heavy transport. What assistance is going to be available so that that sort of technology can be exported?
So we really look for export-ready projects because we're a financier and we're a commercial financier. So we're really looking for projects that are sort of at the point at which they want to export. So as those projects develop and there is an export opportunity, that's where we can come in and support those businesses. And I think it's probably important to note that there doesn't have to be an actual export ready immediately. If they have a plan to export or they want to grow their business so they get to the point of being able to export, we can still provide assistance. So, you know, from our point of view, we are looking at a lot of domestic projects with export potential, not just ready to go right now. So I suppose that's where we can sort of lean in.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Chair.
you. Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. What activity are you seeing in the R&D and university sector around research and development of some of these new technologies? I mean, it's still pretty early days for a lot of it. There's a lot of work going on. Are you seeing any streams of investment coming into the R&D university sector, and do those funding streams match the others that you've talked about for industry more broadly?
Thank you, Senator. I'm happy to take that question. As I mentioned, I was actually up in Newcastle yesterday at the Newcastle Institute for Energy and Resources, which is a very successful institute at the University of Newcastle that is really focused on commercialising research from the university. We met with one company that's still based there that has technology for printing solar panels, essentially much lower cost solution. That's the product of about 26 years of research actually at the university, and they're just at the stage of seeking to raise finance for that. We also went to another company that's probably about a year ahead of them that have actually moved out into manufacturing premises. They have this technology for storing very efficiently heat to release it slowly for grid scale energy, essentially. It's an alternative to a battery. They're the product of about 10 years of research at the university. Both of those companies are looking to raise private financing for it. They've actually been the beneficiaries of a huge amount of government funding over the years. And they're finding, it's fair to say both of them said the same thing, they're finding really strong interest from foreign private investors, but finding it harder to get traction with Australian private investors in that area. And it's not a failure of government funding. Actually, the government funding's been really ample, but they're at that point of trying to connect with Australian financiers.
So I mean, that goes to the commercialisation of the research and the R&D, and I'm pleased to hear that because that's an often criticised part of our economy, that we don't commercialise well the R&D that we're doing. But I'm interested in funding coming in to actually support the R&D and the research itself. So you've mentioned that a lot of that to date has been supported by government funding. That's good, I'll park that. But what about other sources of funding coming in to support the research and the R&D around that research?
Can I say I'm glad you asked? In fact, the model of NIA, this institute, is that they do an incredible amount of fee-for-service research, essentially. We saw barrels there with all the big mining companies' names on it. So they've got PhD students doing commercial research and services, as well as doing their basic research at the same time. So it is a real model that integrates that commercial outcomes and commercialisation with the fundamental research and pays for it very, very successfully. Obviously, we have the long-running Cooperative Research Centres program, which brings together universities and private sector companies, usually to solve specific problems. But that really struck me as quite an impressive model yesterday.
So the mining companies mostly local or locally based, or are there others internationally that are looking at what we're doing?
It's a combination of your big Australian mining companies, foreign mining companies in Australia, but they're also receiving, for example, ore samples from all over the world that come through biosecurity controls and then are tested and evaluated here around a whole lot of very scientific types of areas. And they're kind of doing practical research and these are all PhD students essentially learning as they do it and applying that to their fundamental research. I think Ms. Lawrence spoke about the services, but one of the key areas is obviously in our education sector and training up engineers and some of those result in skilled migration to Australia, but many of them also go back to their home countries as well.
So is there any measure of that?
In terms of the number of students that...
or thinking of investment dollars.
Senator, sorry.
I think it would be each university is running their own program on this. Many of the University of Newcastle is very well known. University of New South Wales, Curtin, University of WA, for example. Each of the universities has active collaborations.
Thank you, Senator Cox.
Thank you. Sorry, my apologies for being late. One of the biggest issues from the Australian Greens, and one of the biggest issues that I have in the resources sector, and I also sit on the Treaties Committee as well, is before these projects reach FID, there's an issue with traditional owners on country. Is this something that's been addressed now as we move towards a greener economy in relation to making sure that there's free, prior and informed consent obtained, both from a finance perspective but also more fundamentally before we get too far down the track? Is that something that's been addressed?
So I might ask Francis to talk about how we work with investors as well and how we help them. I just want to emphasise the collaboration we have with states and territories and the importance of that collaboration with the different layers of government. It's Team Australia working together to attract foreign investment and considering the bigger good and how we make it happen on the ground.
Thanks, Xavier. So absolutely, one of Austrade's role in supporting foreign investors as they enter the Australian market is helping them to understand the regulatory environment and their requirements and responsibilities in Australia and the importance of really their social licence to operate. So we do that in partnership with state and territory governments, as Xavier mentioned, providing information and sharing insights and advice, including introductions to service providers, professional service firms that can help them as they engage with local communities, whether that is Indigenous communities or local communities where wind farms.
How is that being done?
Beg your pardon?
Sorry, how is that actually being done?
How do we provide that advice? So it's in discussions with the investors through conversations by facilitating or arranging meetings together with our state government colleagues, and I would certainly say there are areas where Austrade might lead or where the state government would lead, so it's very much in partnership, and where regulation is state-based, then the state government would understandably lead in providing advice.
If I can just jump in. Alvin Donato, Manager, Energy and Resources. Apart from sovereign stability, skilled workforce and abundant resources, one of Australia's value propositions for natural resources is our high ESG credentials, so as an environmental, social and governance credentials. So the understanding is that if you are doing business with an Australian company that's domiciled here, that means that this company is actually operating at some of the highest levels of ESG credentials or standards anywhere in the world. So that is our value proposition when it comes to Indigenous engagement, Indigenous buy-in, and equitable participation in the resources industry.
The issue is we fundamentally know that that's flawed. We've got the Barossa gas project with Japanese investment, South Korean investment about to happen, we're FID. Traditional owners haven't given consent yet, and they've stopped drilling because of that, and Santos have been forced to do that by the High Court. So, there's similar issues all over the country around cultural heritage. In this Parliament yesterday, the Juukan report was handed down, and this government's implementation of that. So we might be seeing and we know how weak the state and territory laws are, particularly in protecting cultural heritage. And my question would be the ESG in relation to ensuring that from an environmental perspective, the Commonwealth approvals for environment are followed and strengthened in relation to that, and I'm sure we'll see that in the Samuels review next year. But from a social licence perspective, we are still seeing that the sovereignty of this nation, and sovereign in a different way from sovereign in a First Nations context, means that we don't have any rights to country, which means we're not providing any consent to that. And the national priority that I see in the critical minerals strategy doesn't actually achieve free, prior and informed consent from an ESG perspective, nor do we actually see that enacted in a way that it should be. And globally, we know that the US and UK and EU parliaments have a very strong ESG framework that they follow, and here in Australia we don't. In fact, across the ASEAN, the Asia Pacific region, we don't. So, my asking that question is fundamentally, how do we do this better? If we know that these are the common issues and the common trip-ups that we have, particularly when we get to the final investment decision to be made, we are still making this fundamental problem worse because we're not getting upstream and we're not having a conversation about equity investment alongside traditional owners, because we know that's the best practice. If we can actually work with the traditional owner groups, and the UK investors have been very clear that that's something they want to do, but the Australian government are not providing any of that pathway that I can see to allow First Nations investment in their own projects on country, and particularly around renewable energy.
Senator Cox, that might be a good question for Export Finance Australia, if there are any areas that you're aware of that you're assisting with any projects, etc., that with First Nations people that are looking.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Cox. I might just ask a Chief Credit Officer who looks after our environmental and social team to comment. John?
Yep. John Pacey, Chief Credit Officer. Yeah, we apply a environmental social policy to the evaluation of projects which employ leading environmental standards. So for a project in Australia and internationally, we would benchmark that project against what's known as the IFC performance standards. And they include, under Performance Standard 7, consideration of, which is known as Indigenous peoples, that consider the consultation process and whether free, prior and informed consent was obtained where appropriate for the project. So the consideration of those issues is part of our ENS process for evaluating a project.
Thank you. Can I just follow on with that? Is there, in terms of Export Finance Australia, when someone comes to you, what's the metrics? How do people get? How do you pick, I suppose, or prioritise who you support, and how the benefits measured?
So I'm happy to answer that, Chair.
Just walk us through the process,
so we operate like any other financial institution. So effectively, we're lending money that we hope to get back. So we operate and look at a number of different risks. So as my colleague, Mr. Pacey stated, we look at environmental and social risk. We look at the technical risk of a transaction, and key, we look at the credit risk of a transaction, whether a business has the financial capability to support the financing that we provide. And there's a number of different areas that we look at, and on balance, we make a decision around whether or not a company has the financial capability to absorb our funding and be able to operate and pay us back. So no different to any other financial institution, other than we will try and support a company where there may be a commercial opportunity, but they can't get finance from anyone else. So that is our role.
And if I can put the same question to Austrade, in terms of individual businesses, etc., that may approach Austrade for assistance, how do you prioritise them, or what are the metrics that you look at before you say, yep, we'll assist? Or
Sure. Dan, do you want to talk about export, and Francis about investment, how we work?
Yes, so we are trying to use data to work out which companies are growing. So we use a variety of data sources to try to predict that. Obviously, we're looking for companies that are growing and creating jobs, essentially, in Australia to do that. And then I guess we measure after the fact, has our assistance helped the company? So we look to have the companies secure deals. That's some of the numbers I mentioned a bit earlier. We're assisting companies, and we measure the number we're assisting, but we're also measuring which companies actually secure export sales, increasing their revenues, increasing their employment.
Sorry, just to add to that before we move on to investment, we have an internal tool which it's essentially an eligibility test that we'll place across the export clients that we work with, and so that, to Dan's point, that speaks to whether or not they're ready to export, as opposed to being too early stage. But it also goes to looking towards the integrity of that client. So we want to make sure that they are, recognising modern slavery and other aspects of ESG when they're looking at those overseas markets. So we run that lens over them as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
And
So
just looking at the time, sorry.
So I was going to speak to investment. So certainly those fundamental eligibility criteria also apply to our investment clients. The space that Austrade works in with regards to investment is focused on productive foreign direct investment. So this is investment that's going to create new jobs in Australia and help grow priority industries. And so the sectors that we focus on are very much aligned with government priorities. We don't support portfolio investment or, passive private equity investment or pure mergers and acquisitions. It's not about changing the shingle out on the shop front. It's about creating new jobs or enabling Australia to enter new supply chains and drive exports.
Just before we wind up, I'll ask if there's any pressing questions. No? Excellent. Thank you very much. Can I just say thank you for coming today, both to the Export Finance Australia and to Austrade. If you've been asked, if there's anything in particular that we were asked that you couldn't quite get a handle on or didn't have all the information or wish to get back to us, please do so. And you'll be sent a transcript of the evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to the transcription if there's any errors on there. And finally, I'd like to thank you for attending today and briefing us. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the members who were here, Secretariat and Hansard. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Declare the meeting closed. But just before we all run off,